Soy Gŵyl Haf. Welcome to Gŵyl Haf, everyone. Lovely to have you all back with us for another event at the Festival of All Things in Translation. With me today, I have Annie McDermott. Annie is a translator from Spanish and Portuguese, and she has been translated and published even by And Other Stories, Charco, Granta, and many others. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. It's a great festival.
Thank you. Not at all. So I first came across you reading Selva Almada. I read her first book, The Wind That Lay Waste, a couple of years ago now, and it was one of my top books of the year, and it still remains a very perfect novella to me. I think that, you know, the novella might be my favorite form that literature exists in. I think it probably is when I really come down to it, and hers was just this incredibly beautiful encapsulation of a single day. And so I was wondering, then obviously I came to get Dead Girls afterwards. I was like, well, this is the writer, I'm going to be buying everything off. And you had translated Dead Girls, and Dead Girls is a very different novel. It is, first of all, not exactly fiction. It's a journalistic piece that follows 3 femicides in Argentina in the 1980s when Selva Almada was growing up, and it interweaves with that her own life, her own experience, and is, I think, an exploration of how the gender violence is not the violence of an urban city. Gender violence is intimate and exists in whatever size of not dwelling, what's the word, size of place that you live, and is intensely personal. And I was wondering how you came to translate this novel and what it was like translating this novel that is so hard to read.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult to read, and it was definitely difficult to translate as well. So it came to me through Carolina Orloff of Charco Press. I hadn't actually read any Selva Almada, not even The Wind That Lays Waste, when she passed me a copy of Chicas Muertas in Spanish after we met up in London one evening when it was still possible to meet up in London before the pandemic, and asked me if I'd be interested in translating it. And I just remember kind of casually opening it on the tube home that evening, and then just I couldn't really believe what I was reading. It just felt electric. It just felt so, the writing felt so kind of perfect and so direct and so powerful, and the approach to this incredibly urgent subject matter just felt so right and so different. And so yeah, I was really hooked kind of from the moment I started reading it. And then in terms of translating it, it was definitely a very different translation experience to other books that I'd worked on, partly precisely because of that kind of position between non-fiction and not really fiction, but kind of the techniques of fiction, like novelistic techniques. So it's quite, so it felt, because of the non-fiction element and because of the fact that these were real girls whose stories are being told, real people's lives, I felt very, like it was very, very important. The stakes were very high, and my translation had to be very, very correct, very accurate, very kind of just transmit all this in exactly the way that it was transmitted into the original book. And I think that meant that I sort of forgot how to translate in a way, because I was just so keen for it to be true and accurate that I kind of forgot that there are a lot of different kinds of truth in translation. So I'd produced this very kind of almost literal translation that felt very wooden and very stiff when I read it back, which is exactly not the way that the book should feel. And I had to kind of remember how to translate all over again, and realize that sometimes you have to kind of loosen your grip on the original in order to get the feeling of the original and the kind of life and the urgency of the original across. And so that was a bit of a kind of journey when it came to translating it. And it was quite interesting to read about Selva's experiences writing the book, where she kind of went through quite a similar thing, where initially she thought, this is so important, these are real people's lives, I need to write an extremely accurate book. And then she found that her book didn't really have the kind of life that she wanted it to have, because it was so kind of bound to the facts. And then she realized, no, like, I'm a novelist. What I need to do is use what I know how to do in order to make this book mine. And so she ended up using these kind of more novelistic techniques, these lyrical descriptions, these kind of memories and reflections to give it the kind of life it has. So yeah, I think that was the experience for me, and I was interested to find that it was kind of the experience for her as
that that is so interesting, especially because it's obviously a departure for her. I think she hasn't written something that's similar to this before.
No.
And again, her next book, you're translating her next book as well, I believe. The Brickmakers. Her Brickmakers is more of a return to fiction.
Yeah, it is. It's actually the second in a kind of trilogy, of which The Wind That Lays Waste is the first, and then one that's just come out in Spanish is the third. And it's I always hope I won't be asked to translate what the trilogy is called, because in English it just sounds so sort of lame, like the trilogy of men, la trilogía de varones, like the trilogy of kind of male people. But yeah, it's kind of a trilogy of books that look at masculinity and kind of this men's world of the northeast, the Chaco province of Argentina, and kind of, but also women's place in this men's world. But yeah, Brickmakers is much more of a kind of continuation of The Wind That Lays Waste in kind of the feel of it, although linguistically it's very different, because it becomes much more, the language is much more slangy. There's a lot more like very, very regional phrases and words. So yeah, it's similar, but going off in quite a different direction as well.
Regional slang is often something people say is very difficult to translate, and I imagine there's quite a bit of that in Dead Girls as well.
Yeah, there was. It's always something that's a big part, I think, of Selva's writing, like this very, very strong sense of place, and part of that is this very kind of, the language plays a big role in creating that sense of place. And yeah, it was really difficult. It's always difficult translating slang, but I think particularly with Dead Girls, because the risks of translating slang, the things that you want to avoid, would have just been so catastrophic when it comes to Dead Girls. Because yeah, one of the things that you can risk with translating slang is kind of uprooting the book and relocating it in the place where the slang that you're using in English comes from. You don't want, like, ending up with a book that sounds like it's taking place in South London, or that sounds like it's taking place in the Bronx, or similar. And this, speaking of the sense of place, it's so important that the sense of place is there, that you don't want to kind of disrupt that by using words which feel too much like they belong elsewhere. And then similarly, I think another risk with slang is kind of overdoing it and making it seem sort of like the characters are performing themselves. Like, it makes the slang kind of seems forced, and like it's there sort of to be slang. So you can say, look, there's slang in this book in the translation, and like it's so important for Dead Girls to feel so immediate, and that it has to feel like there's almost nothing between you and Selva as she's investigating. Obviously there's quite a gap between you and the girls themselves, because this is the nature of the book, they're unsolved crimes. But yeah, like the immediacy is really important, and the urgency, and so you don't want the slang to create a distance. So yeah, I think the challenge was kind of finding slang that doesn't feel obtrusive or from elsewhere, but that does somehow give a sense of the tone of the book. So yeah, it was tough.
Amalda's oh my god, I got such a tickle this morning. Need to drink water.
Oh, you.
Amalda's book is one of a few works that have called me recently to say that, you know, nearly every woman I know, if not all, has been raped, and that therefore we also need to understand that basically every man has been a perpetrator a rapist, it's even then you want to avoid those words. But actually, like, that's what I've been feeling called to do a lot recently, is to not avoid those words, because, you know, that would have been an uncontroversial statement a few years ago if you just used the word sort of sexual violence, or have had horrible things that they were uncomfortable or uncomfortable situations. And actually, I think that naming those as rape is a very powerful sort of reclaiming and like making people understand actually what those situations are. They're not just uncomfortable, they are non-consensual. And I think Almada does that in a really great way in this book as well, through sort of linking the worst of a femicide to everything else that women experience. I wonder if you want to talk about the violence in the book a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important thing about the book, and something that I was thinking about a lot in the wake of the Sarah Everard killing as well, and some of the kind of language around that. I was thinking that it's really important to do what Dead Girls does, which is kind of show that all of this stuff happens on a continuum, and to show that there's sort of everyday sexual harassment, but that also women are killed by men. And women being killed by men isn't kind of a weird anomaly or an aberration that has nothing to do with anything that happens in everyday life or the structures of everyday society, but that it's just about whether you're lucky or not as a woman. Like, it's like that kind of exchange that happened on Twitter with the kind of, yeah, not all men, but women don't know which kind of man each man is. So there is that kind of, women live with the sense that things are on a continuum all the time. And I think Dead Girls does an amazing job of sort of dramatizing that, or making that real, or just showing how that happens, by the way that she's telling the stories of women to whom just the worst does happen, women who are raped and who are murdered, whilst also weaving in her own experiences of kind of walking down a deserted street or hitchhiking, or kind of being in these situations in which you're vulnerable, but they're quite common. And so you kind of find yourself very worried about her, but because you're so reminded of the fact that it could be different, and she's very keen to emphasize she's one of the lucky ones, she's not a great deal separates her from the girls who weren't the lucky ones. And so, yeah, it really dramatizes this kind of feeling of paranoia, of kind of like, oh, it couldn't possibly happen to me, but I do need to be careful, and like that it does happen to some people, but I should like, and I think it really brings that to life, and I think that's really powerful and important to do.
Absolutely. And the violence doesn't just come from some of the dangerous situations. Some of the violence Almada explores early in the book is within family units and with homes. It's control and patterns of behavior within a home that were unremarkable to her and are still largely unremarkable, and we still would fail to take action in other people's lives. If we saw them going on, we wouldn't sort of feel able to. And I think that sort of, as you mentioned, not all men, well, it's just not all men to you, but actually, yes, all men at some point in their life, you know, that sort of, we like, do you think our sex ed is that good that those men as boys weren't making mistakes and errors? Like, that would be a different world that we lived in. And the violence in Dead Girls is personal. You know, these crimes were not exactly random. They were all known to the victims.
Yeah, completely. And it just, and also the way that Dead Girls kind of creates quite a, like, it sets out to create quite a complete picture of these girls' lives. And that complete seems like a funny word to use in relation to Dead Girls, because it's so sparse and there are things that are left unsaid and things that we don't know. But it really shows how the patriarchy operates on all these different levels of people's lives. Like, it's not like we talk about how the girls were unlucky, which they were, but also every day of their lives something is happening which is related to these power imbalances. And from kind of the jobs they're doing, the fact they have to go out to work as young teenagers, really, the fact it's so difficult for them to afford their education, all of this stuff. And it sort of shows how gender relations are so bound up in class and in socioeconomic position and all of this stuff. And it just shows how it's all constantly weighing on people's lives. And it's not, maybe you're unlucky one day, but it's not like until then you just emerge unscathed from the society that we live in. And I think, it's powerful for that reason too, despite, like, Selva's very keen to say that she's not trying to write, she's not exactly writing kind of didactic books. She wants to show things rather than tell you what to think. And there's no real, there isn't a great deal of kind of abstract theory in Dead Girls, or there's none. Like, it's all sort of showing you what happens to these women. And I think that's what's so powerful about it as well. It's kind of a real lesson, it's a real demonstration rather than a kind of abstract, disquisition.
Yeah, I completely agree. There are several books recently and sort of that tie both the sparsity of writing style with the subject matter, and then with also showing, not telling. And I don't mean by sort of bringing these books as sort of a talking point here, I do not mean to say that they are a trend or that these women ought to be compared as writers and never sort of considered by themselves. Obviously, sort of the reason they are always often compared is because these are the first time these stories are being told. So that's why we feel like all of a sudden there's all of these around us. But obviously that is just because these people never had voices to write books before than the last few years. So the books I'm talking about is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. We have Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchior and Slash and Burn by Claudia. And all three look at gender violence. And I feel like there is something that links them that is deeper than that. I know that you sort of worked on Slash and Burn as an editor and know a little bit about the other two as well. So do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think there's such interesting books to compare. I did an event with Lizzie Jaquette, the translator of Minor Detail last year, in which I was talking about Dead Girls and she was talking about Minor Detail, and it was so interesting to think about the books side by side. Sort of, I mean, there are a lot of similarities between Dead Girls and Minor Detail, which kind of in terms of the premise of the book, they both have a narrator in the present day who sort of takes it upon herself to investigate these historic crimes to which she feels a very strong link. In the case of Selva Almada, because she was living in the same area as one of the girls who was killed and heard about her when she was a teenager. And then in the case of Minor Detail, the protagonist is a Palestinian woman who finds out about an Arab woman being killed by Israeli soldiers. I think it's precisely 25 years before she was born, that she feels like there's something kind of linking her to this crime. So I think they're already kind of setting up quite an interesting relationship between the present and the past in terms of these kinds of crimes, these kinds of acts of violence. And then Minor Detail also does a lot with that kind of feeling that we were talking about of how you have to go about your everyday life really aware that you can be lucky or you can not be lucky. And they're in both Dead Girls and in Minor Detail, the narrator is going about their life specifically with these crimes in mind. And so kind of completely aware of the risk, aware of the possibility of just horrific things happening. So I remember Lizzie Jaquette talking about how the scenes where her narrator is crossing Israeli checkpoints and she's dripping with sweat, she's really, really nervous. And to an objective outsider, they might think, well, nothing out of the ordinary is happening. This is just an everyday situation. And maybe she's being paranoid. But of course, if you know what can happen, if you know that the worst can happen, then are you being paranoid or are you just responding to the world that you live in quite a reasonable way? And I think So both books kind of deal with that, like sort of being almost like gaslit by the world that you live in, which is telling you that you're being paranoid whilst also showing you that there are reasons to be paranoid. And then, yeah, Slash and Burn is just another really interesting comparison, and one that I was editing whilst editing Julia Sanchez's amazing translation while I was working on Dead Girls. So I had them sort of much in my mind. And yeah, similarly to Minor Details, similarly to Dead Girls, Slash and Burn kind of deals with, it kind of changes the scale. It's an attempt to tell quite a big story, a big national story, a big story of kind of, yeah, that is often told in headlines, in statistics, in kind of sweeping narratives, backing up people's theories. And it's an attempt to change the scale to avoid the kind of the standard headline statistics, etc., by looking at the scale of just individual people, individual everyday women's lives in the wake of these kind of cataclysmic events. And I think Claudia Hernandez is doing something quite similar to Selva Almada, although in a very different way, which is kind of looking at different kinds of truth, different, yeah, like the kind of the difference between truth and facts, and maybe how far facts can and can't get you when it comes to reaching the truth about something. So in Slash and Burn, one of the sort of most striking things about it is the fact that the characters aren't named, the places aren't named, except Paris, but the country where it takes place isn't named. It's just the city, the town, etc. And that's kind of, yeah, eschewing one kind of facts to sort of say, well, there are other kinds that can tell you a lot more. And I think in Dead Girls, Selva Almada is kind of, she does include a lot of facts, but I think also to make you question how useful these facts can be. So, you know, she includes the police reports about when the girls' bodies are found, and you learn that one of the bodies is at a 45-degree angle on the bed to the wall, and one sandal is under the bed and one sandal is in the middle of the room. And like, you can know all these facts, but it doesn't mean you know why it happened, what it was like for the girl. And so I think they're both kind of looking at facts and kind of other things that are true besides facts. And so I think they're really interesting. And then my big confession is that I haven't yet read Hurricane Season. I know, it's really bad. I've had it on my shelf for ages.
You're gonna love it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to read it. I've read bits of it. I kind of flicked through it when I was translating Brickmakers and desperately trying to learn how to translate Slang as well as Sophie Hughes. So I've read bits and it seems great. But yeah.
When I find that you know, sort of you might read a little bit to begin with, and then there's just this turning point in it where you can't stop. And everyone who I know who's read it is like, yeah, like at this one point, it's because, you know, how it is structured so unusually without paragraphs and all this sort of thing, like, and it just flows and you just can't, you just like, I've got to, like, it is really, yeah, I think it is. I think if I was not that anyone's asked me to do that, but if I was going to sort of rank my sort of like 4 favorite books in this style that I do particularly really like, I do really like a sparse writing style, I would say that Hurricane Season, Wind That Lays Waste, Nelly Campoveo's Cartucho, My Mother's Hand, and Minor Detail, for me make a really strong quartet there of just incredible writing.
Yeah, I'm really excited for Hurricane Season, and I kind of, it seems similar to Minor Detail, just in that like the ending of Minor Detail is so like kind of overwhelming and intense, and when you hear people talking about Hurricane Season who've just read it, they have a similar feeling that something has definitely happened to them, like they've definitely been through something. So yeah,
it's quite well, I swear we'll come back to Selva Almada in a second, but it is quite it is quite hopeless. I remember finishing it and calling up a friend and talking about it and just being like, this is incredible, I've just read this amazing book, and then also saying but I want to have more hope than I think was in this book. And I think that you have to confront. I don't disagree with any of her philosophy in that book. I completely agree with its sort of worldview. But also to like go and live your life, you have to have more hope, I think, or I have to have more hope in my daily life than when I sort of sit down and read that and go, yes, that is actually what the world looks like.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the way Selva Almada kind of achieves the impossible with Dead Girls and does manage to include some hope, despite the fact that sort of, I think, a really kind of honest hope, which is the only kind that really works after you've been talking about such awful stuff in such a kind of frank way. But somehow she does manage to, I guess, with the kind of final scene of kind of female solidarity, kind of these small victories. She talks about small victories, and without kind of wanting to underplay without at all underplaying any of the awful stuff that happened, I think finding those little moments of hope is something that also makes the book very interesting and well crafted and just a bit nicer to read.
Sort of going back to that sense of facts and supplement, like needing to go beyond facts, I think it's quite an interesting to view sort of those facts as actually representing masculine and masculine policing, and that is sort of, the attitude with which gender violence is treated when it is a femicide. Like, the body is laying here, we can like look at the scene and photograph it, and this and this, and complete lack of females and women's experiences within that. And that, like you said, like Almada is actually telling that fuller story, even though she doesn't have the facts. These are unsolved murders.
Yeah, completely. Like, the police are the purveyors of useless facts in Dead Girls, and they're also very male and very kind of uninterested in women's experience and don't do a very good job of dealing with the families on human terms at all. And so like linking them to the facts and to that kind of approach is quite striking, I think.
Something I found quite striking about the book itself was how everyone turns, including Almada as the narrator, to psychic mediums. And that's not an experience I have much experience of, but it's really central to the book and how everyone's communicating with the dead girls. And I wonder why, if you wanted to talk a little bit about how that is central to the book.
Yeah, it's such an interesting part of the book, and it's so interesting the role that La Señora, the psychic, the tarot reader that Selva goes to see, becomes so central to the book, and those sessions with her become just a crucial part of understanding what's going on in the book. And it was interesting to read in an interview with Selva Almada that actually she wasn't planning to include those in the book at all. She went to see La Señora just when she'd run out of money and couldn't carry on her research for a while. She couldn't travel to any of these places to carry on interviewing people. She was in a bit of a dead, that's a bad word, in a bit of a rut with her. Oh no, that's a bad word too. All words are tainted. She was unable to continue with her project for a while. And so she decided to fill the time by going to see La Señora just for herself, just to kind of see what she could learn herself. And it was only later that her editor suggested that she include these sessions, this whole thread of her research in the book, which I thought was super interesting, because this is the same editor really good editor, I think, who also encouraged Selva to include her own experiences from her own kind of, life as a young girl, as a teenager growing up in the book, which also is what makes the book powerful in all the ways we've been discussing. So this editor really, knows what's what. But so Selva hadn't been planning to include the sessions with La Senora, which I think is a really good reminder of the fact that it's more than just a literary device. It's something that people did and people do. But then once La Senora and the sessions with her are in the book, they become this kind of perfect metaphor in a way for what the writer is doing, what Selva is doing as she tries to write this book, and her kind of attempts to reach the unreachable, to reach these. There's this, like, the big absence at the center of Dead Girls is just the girls themselves. We don't, what happened to them, what they were thinking, etc. Like, we just don't know. And so Selva is trying to imagine, trying to kind of reach some truth about that, and doing it through sessions with this psychic. It just kind of it just enacts what she's trying to do the whole time she's writing the book, which is to, like, kind of broach this divide and get to manage to communicate with these girls. And it also kind of shows how difficult it is at the beginning, but also how difficult it is at the end. Like, she finds it really difficult in her last session with La Senora to let go. She's holding onto La Senora's hands, and by which she's kind of in contact with the girls, and then it's time for her to let go, and that's almost more ending that communication is almost more difficult than beginning it, because it's so final and it's such a so I think that was really a really interesting thing about how that works. And also, like, it seems really fascinating that one of the main kind of things that stems from one of the sessions with La Senora is quite a non-supernatural strand of the book, which is where La Senora says maybe it would make sense to understand the place of these girls in society more, and almost sort of the material conditions of their lives. And that's what prompts Selva to start talking about young women, teenagers going out to work, for example, and all the different kinds of work that can be. And that's prompted by a visit to a psychic, but it's actually something that's so much rooted in real life. And then it leads her to thinking about her own experiences going out with her friends who are going out to work as young teenagers. And so, yeah, I guess it kind of comes back to this idea of different kinds of truth and different kinds of facts. She's not getting facts from La Senora, but she is being turned towards a lot of different kinds of truth. So yeah, it becomes a really fascinating part of the book.
I like that idea a lot. I think it's so useful and interesting to have those conversations that definitely don't exist. That do exist in a British context, but aren't as central, maybe in a British context. Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Before we sort of move on to talking a little bit about how you got into translation and your sort of how you ended up in the position that you are in, I wondered, is there anything else you'd like to touch on that we've sort of missed out of Almada's work?
No, I think we've covered lots.
Good. In which case then, so how did you come to translate from Spanish and Portuguese? I know that you studied English literature at university, and sort of that translation wasn't a part of your early life, if that's right.
Yeah, it was. I feel like translators often say that it was by chance, and I feel like it was kind of by chance, but also it seemed to make perfect sense as soon as I realized what was going on. But yeah, I had studied English literature at university and done a master's in that, and was having a bit of a kind of existential crisis following that about kind of whether to stay in academia, which didn't quite feel like the right place for me, but I couldn't quite let go of the kind of incredibly close reading and close engagement with words that comes with studying literature. And I was that felt just essential to my life, but I wasn't sure if I wanted the end product of that to be academic articles that were going to be read by mostly other academics. And that just felt like a bit of a mismatch. And then at the height of my existential crisis, I moved to Mexico, very kind of randomly and without really speaking very much Spanish at all. Before I went, I had a friend who was doing an internship at the Austrian embassy. He said, I've got a spare room, why don't you come? And okay.
The Austrian embassy, naturally.
Why not? Yeah, it was, and then living in Mexico was, and learning Spanish, I briefly went to a language school in Guatemala for from Mexico for a month to kind of properly learn the grammar and learn about communism as well, which was, yeah, grammar and communism, the two main focuses of this completely amazing language school in the mountains of Guatemala. And then went back to Mexico, and then I was, yeah, teaching English and learning Spanish. And it was my first experience of really kind of living in between two languages and having two languages in my head all the time, and just spending my time thinking about how they mapped onto each other and what the gaps between them were. And just, that just felt, I just loved it. And it felt like just the right place for me to be. And then when literary translation occurred to me, I had friends who were translating that other way when I was in Mexico, and ended up sort of helping them, answering their questions about phrases in English. I remember explaining what haddock were at some point, and the connotations if someone was eating haddock. I can't remember what I said. What are the connotations if someone's eating haddock? But anyway, these sorts of things. And yeah, as soon as I realized that literary translation existed as a possibility, it just felt like exactly the perfect thing for me. It would enable me to read incredibly closely, engage with words in this really kind of deep and particular way, but then produce something that wasn't an academic article, but which was a book that was going to be read by people, by ordinary people, often not very many, but hopefully more one day.
ever increasing amount.
Yeah, by one.
If anyone is looking for a book that perfectly encapsulates the experience you just described, 50 Sounds by Polly Barton has just come out. And it's very much exploring what it is like to live between the two languages. She's also speaking at Gŵyl, so you can go find her talk on another day. Slight bit, yeah. So why then did you or how then even did you add Portuguese into that mix if you've been in Mexico City? And also, like, how did you get good enough, like when did you feel confident enough to go for translation?
So yeah, I think the question about Portuguese is easier, so I'll answer that first, like a politician. Which was, yeah, when I was living in Mexico. I mean, partly again, it was chance in that I had one of my students when I was teaching English was a guy from Brazil, and he persuaded me to take payment in Portuguese lessons and I was kind of tempted by that, and ended up beginning to learn Portuguese with this guy, and just kind of, I loved it. I loved the sound of it. I loved, I think Cervantes said that Portuguese is like Spanish without the bones, or with the bones taken out, and it has that. I think that's a really great description of it. And so I was sort of being intrigued by Portuguese, and then sort of had other Brazilian friends when I was living in Mexico, and also really liked the idea of repeating my slightly strange experience where I turn up apropos of nothing in a Latin American capital city and kind of try and like cobble together a life and learn to speak the language. And so ended up doing that with Sao Paulo. So after living in Mexico, I moved to Sao Paulo for a year or so, and had just a really wonderful time. Learned more about communism, learned more about grammar. And yeah, then to the much more difficult question of how do you know you're good enough to translate? And I think if you speak to a lot of translators, they will say, we don't know. It's really, like, I think a lot of translators feel imposter syndrome for different reasons. I think the thing that makes me, I think it sometimes comes on a kind of text by text basis. Like, there are texts that I would feel like I wasn't confident to translate, I think, and texts that I do. And I think the test is, can you hear it in your head? I think if you can hear the voice in your head, and you know what you're aiming for, and you know what you have to make the English do, then I think you do you do feel confident enough to do it. And even if, you know, maybe you don't understand all of it at first, but you understand what it feels like, how the words sound. And I think it's, if you can't hear something in your head, that you probably quite justifiably have a crisis of confidence, because it's hard to know what you're aiming for, because you're always aiming for more than just like accuracy. You're aiming for the feel of it, and if you don't know what the feel of it is, then you can't do that. So I think that's, and then maybe as time goes on and as you live more in that language, and as you read more and as you translate more and just think more about the words, maybe the kind of the number of texts that you feel like you can hear in your head increases. And so maybe that's how you kind of increase your confidence to take projects on. Although it's complicated, because sometimes you can hear something in your head but not at all hear how the English would be, or the English can feel quite outside your comfort zone, which is definitely the case with Brickmakers by Selva Almada, for example. Like I could hear that in my head. So I thought, that's okay, I'm allowed to translate it. But the English voice was very, very, very far from my voice. And so that was quite a sort of long, difficult process of trying to find that voice in English. But yeah.
That's really beautifully put. That's definitely going to find its way onto a Gŵyl quote somewhere. I think it's always useful for sort of translators or aspiring translators, or just everyone, to hear a little bit about like how you came to be a full-time translator. And I know that you've talked a little bit about how you know, you are in the position to be able to be a full-time literary translator, but that is actually really an unusual experience.
Yeah, I think this is a really fraught topic at the moment, and rightly so, because it's so, I mean, in terms of how I came to be a full-time literary translator, actually I'm not even going to answer that first, because it feels like I can't say I'm a full-time literary translator without extensive caveats. So I guess what I mean is, since like mid-2017, almost all my work has been literary translation, and with that I support myself. It's not very much money, but I live. But then the caveat is that I'm not in a very precarious situation outside my day-to-day life. Like, and even my day-to-day life, I don't have any dependents. I live with a partner with whom I split the costs, but also I think in the greater scheme of things, I'm from a middle-class family, and I know that if everything went horribly wrong, I ran out of money completely, my life wouldn't collapse around me. I could go and live with my mum. There's a big safety net, without which I think I wouldn't be able to sleep at night earning what I earn. I think this is what literary translation needs to kind of deal with, the fact that it is shutting out people who need their job to give them a lot more security than translation ever can. So I'm a full-time literary translator, but one with a lot of privileges, and I'm kind of cheating, but it is what I do full-time, and that is my only money. So yeah, how I came to be a full-time translator. I mean, when I came back from Brazil, I got a job in an office and was editing articles about education policy for some years, and fitting translation in kind of in the evenings and at weekends. And kind of during that time, what I was mostly doing was short stories and poetry, and just short pieces that could be published in literary magazines. And kind of, I think I was learning how to translate during a lot of that time, and also had the lucky position of being able to really choose what I did, because it wasn't at all a source of income. And yeah, I was kind of trying to take whatever opportunities were available, and not always are they available for someone with a full-time office job, so like that can be difficult. But yeah, I did one of the mentorships run by the British Centre for Literary Translation with Margaret Jill Costa, which was amazing. And
big Portuguese translator there.
Yeah. Cool. So I was sort of gradually, and then like a lucky thing with my job was that I was able to kind of reduce how much time I did it. So I was kind of sneaking out the back door of my office job by first being part-time and then working 2 days a week, and then working 2 days a week and not even having to be present in the office, and therefore kind of sending off my edited articles from Mexico and Tbilisi in Georgia and similar. And that kind of, and yeah, just trying to use that. Yeah, I was able to fill the time that I had when I went part-time with more translation work, and then kind of magically when I was quite reasonably made redundant from my office job because I was working 2 days a week from Mexico, and I realized that weren't really getting much value out of me. That was when I got my first book contract, which was really good timing and just really was just luck. And I think, yeah, things carried on from there. I think I wouldn't be a full-time literary translator without Charco Press, which also set up pretty much when I went freelance, and has become a very wonderful source of work, source of books to translate. So yeah, a lot of lucky things happened, which is problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the like within that conversation, lucky things only happen to certain people. But like it has no reflection on the quality of your translation. Or obviously these things are interlinked, but you know, we don't. The system is what's broken, not the.
Yeah, exactly, definitely.
Yeah. What are you working on at the moment? And I know that you've just done Wars of the Interior, which is a non-fiction book. So not a Charco one for once. Do you want to talk a little bit about Wars of the Interior, the brick makers? What sort of, I know you're doing Annie Horowitz at the moment as well.
Yeah, the next Ariana Horowitz.
Ariana, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's fine. So yeah, I've got Wars of the Interior here, which has come out a couple of months ago, more than that. What is time during a pandemic? Came out in February, and it's a really amazing book. It's non-fiction, it's reportage, and it's focused on the Peruvian Amazon, and it's about indigenous environmental defenders in the Amazon in Peru, battling corporations, mafias, combinations of both, most frequently, to protect their lives and their homes, their health. And there are 3 chapters. One is wood, one is gold, and one is oil, and each focuses on a different community, a different sort of campaign or campaigner. And it's an amazing book, and I think it's a really interesting one to think about, again, in relation to Slash and Burn, in relation to all of these books that are kind of changing the scale on which they're covering these issues, changing the scale on which they're telling these stories. Like in Wars of the Interior, as in Dead Girls, as in Slash and Burn, you have a really strong sense of how far away the capital city is. Like this is like these, and sort of the absence of the state. The state is not present, the state is not fulfilling its responsibilities or it's doing the opposite and doing bad things. And so yeah, I think the focus on the everyday struggles of individual people is really strong in Wars of the Interior as well. It makes it an interesting book to think about in relation to those. There's the epigraph is from Svetlana Alexeyevich, and it's about in which she says that she wants to reduce history to the scale of the human being, which I think is just exactly what's happening with so many of these books. And it's just, so it's interesting to think about in relation to that, and just a really great book by Josef Zarate, who's a really great journalist and very nice. I
meant to ask this earlier actually. How much communication do you tend to have with your authors?
So it depends. I think always some, and then depending on the book and how, like, I end up asking Selva Almada, for example, a lot of questions because there are a lot of words that not only do I not know in her books, but also that my friends from Argentina also don't know because they're not from this particular region. So I think, yeah, with some writers you end up asking a lot of questions. And yeah, in relation to Wars of the Interior, I feel like I became friends with Joseph Zarate by sending him the wrong file by mistake at one point, which was actually a file of a really early draft of the entire translation of his book, rather than a document with questions in it. And so after he boldly tried to respond to that document as if it was a list of questions, which was one of the worst things that's ever happened to me, we became friends, which is why I say that he's very nice. So yeah, it depends on the author and how much I humiliate myself by mistake in my communications with them, but always some contact. And it's always a really nice part of the work, definitely. Yeah, oh yeah, and so what I'm working on at the moment is the final book in Ariana Havitz's involuntary trilogy, coming after Die My Love and Feeble Minded, and it's a co-translation with Carolina Olof again, which makes it a lot of fun to work on. She's just sent me her first draft, so I'm just going through it now. And yeah, it's definitely just another book in the, not just, but it's definitely another book in the Ariana Havitz vein of kind of frustrated passions, unfrustrated passions, and kind of claustrophobic relationships between mothers and children. In this case, the relationship is a single mother and her teenage son, and this the kind of obsessive, possessive, passionate love that she feels to him, and that is not necessarily kind of requited, if requited is the right word, because he's a teenager and he's kind of making his own friends and kind of, yeah, edging into adulthood. And so it's, yeah, it's really fascinating and just fun, because her books are fun, just sarcastic and horrible and mean and yeah, and beautiful. So yeah.
Oh, great. I can't wait for the brick makers later this year either. Sort of as we wrap up, I just want to sort of end on a point that we were sort of talking about concerning privilege, and sort of what can we do more of in translation, and what would we like to see more of, and where, how do we help, not help, because the independent presses are leading the way. It is the big presses, the behemoths, as it were, who who could really lead the way and who could enact radical change and who aren't enacting radical change. So how does that conversation sort of where do we take it forward? Not that you have to have the be-all and end-all answer to that.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think this is a really exciting time for translation, because I think these are questions that are being asked, and a lot of people I'd probably say too late, but these conversations are happening, and people are looking much more closely at sort of, yeah, who gets translated, who does the translating, how they do the translating, like all of these different stages of the process, and what kind of power dynamics are at play, what kind of structural racism, classism are involved in the process. And I think the first stage is asking these questions, but I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say the first stage is asking these questions, so let's just ask them and then have a nice chat and then we'll work it out, because yeah, I think definitely more needs to be done. I mean, I think it's great the way Gŵyl is. You were talking about how charco is something that you wish you could pronounce. Gŵyl is something I wish I could pronounce. How do you pronounce it?
Oh, Gŵyl. It's actually really funny enough. It was a confusing word for me to learn, because I live near the river Wye, which is the River Gwy in Welsh, GWY.
Okay.
And then Gŵyl means festival, and it's that little I forget the word for, it's not an accent, it's a different one than an accent, it's got a splat bit at the top.
Oh yeah.
That changes the noise of the W, so it's Gŵyl. Yeah,
Gŵyl. But yeah, so I think like the program of Gŵyl is really brilliant this year, because it does seem like it's responding to and being excited by this kind of realization that translation isn't only done by middle-class white people, and that books aren't only written by similarly middle-class white people. And I think that's really, really great. And I think just representation.
What?
I think representation is an important step. And then I really want to see what happens.
And like sort of bring it on that point, like well, we are still not in the place I would like to be with that, and that sort of that is the product of the information that you have. Like I really noticed a difference between, so I did the first year on a whim, and so was reaching out to people that I had at fairly close ability to have contact with, and so that was fine. You know, that festival was about doing the festival, but afterwards I was like, you know, that really wasn't representative enough, like very clearly, you know, and sort of especially when you come to African languages in translation, because there isn't particularly often also the work that does exist in from the African continent and different countries within Africa tends to be a European language, so Francophone, Anglophone, Spanish, and then you also have Arabic, and that sort of, you know, I thought I could Google, you know, Shona translated book and find something, and you don't. Like, you know, that isn't sort of, so you know, you do have to put more research in. So maybe that would be sort of where we take that point. It's time. You can't just say I'm going to do it. You know, and we're not there yet, like either, you know, we like that's very much something I've just started.
But I think the Gŵyl program is really great. I'm really looking forward to watching all the events.
Well, thank you so much for being a part of it today. I really enjoyed this event, and Dead Girls is available from our bookshop.org page with Green Ink booksellers, or from the Charter website directly. Sort of, there's a couple of ways you can buy it. All the rest of our talks are available on our YouTube throughout the festival. We also have a Patreon if anyone wants to give any money to support like the Zoom license and things like that. So we are all volunteer. Like, this is not an organisation with that much funding, unfortunately, yet. Maybe in the future. If anyone wants to give us funding, please, we are here. So please do check out Dead Girls and Brickmakers when it comes out. And thank you so much, Annie, for joining me today. I really enjoyed this chat.
Thank you.
Bye.